Morning. I'd like to welcome our next witnesses, Ms Michelle Melbourne and Ms Chris Folkes from the Canberra Business Council. Information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could I ask you both to state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Good morning, my name's Michelle Melbourne. I'm the Chair of the Canberra Business Council.
I'm Chris Folkes and I'm the CEO of Canberra Business Council.
Thank you very much for appearing today. Do either of you or both of you wish to make an opening statement before we move to questions?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I'd like to note that the Canberra Business Council hasn't put in a submission, and we're very pleased to be able to give you some verbal information today. So I'll give you a little bit of background, and we'd be happy to follow up with some of this information in writing if you'd like that. The Canberra Business Council is a not-for-profit member organisation, and through its affiliates we represent over 10,000 registered businesses, large and small, across all industries throughout the capital region. Our members range from privately owned local small businesses to public Australian companies and multinationals. As you can imagine, that gives us a great insight and great a finger on the pulse, if you like, as to what's happening across industry sectors in the context of supplying federal government. So my name is Michelle Melbourne, and my day job is I'm a co-founder and director of an Australian software technology company called IntelliDocs, and personally I have over 20 years experience in dealing with the Australian ICT sector, where IntelliDocs is a supplier to over 20 federal government agencies. So as you can imagine, over many years I have first-hand experience dealing commercially with dozens of federal government agencies and their various procurement strategies and the nuances between them. But equally, I have a lot of experience in negotiating and dealing with overseas contracts with overseas governments and seen the good and the bad and the ugly in that regard. So it's my great pleasure to be here today to talk about something that I know a little bit about. The Council is committed to providing constructive feedback and practical remedies for an effective and efficient federal government procurement framework, and we look forward to being an active partner in this process, and thank you for welcoming us here today. The Canberra region's private sector is heavily invested in supplying the federal government, as you can imagine. The avenues of Canberra are full of industry players whose products and services compete to supply government. Our members are acutely impacted through the federal government's procurement policy, and when that process becomes onerous or complex or it's perceived to be not fair, that's when Chris and our colleagues at the Business Council start to get direct feedback from our members who don't hold their punches. The message is coming through loud and clear right now that there's a range of issues in relation to fair access, if you like, for Australian industry in supplying to federal government. Now, this is not just anecdotal. We, at the Business Council, we operate a very professional organisation that operates a range of industry task forces where we have meetings similar to this, where we gain feedback from our members. And we focus on specific industry drivers such as innovation, exporting and small business. And so these are valuable think tanks that give us evidence-based ideas, if you like, and remedies to what we should all be working towards. And essentially, we believe that the Australian government should be deliberate about growing Australian industry and driving innovation, and that collaboration within supply chains and between industry and government is going to be the key. So I'm happy to pause there and we can open up for some more conversation. Obviously, we've got plenty of ideas.
Thank you very much, Ms Melbourne. Thank you for appearing today. Can I ask you, with respect to the Canberra Business Council's engagement with your membership, what kind of feedback are you currently getting about the nature of engaging with the government for the purposes of hopefully a successful tender?
Yeah.
I'm, as you know, quite familiar with some of the barriers that have been experienced, but I'm very interested in this committee getting some evidence on what the contemporary issues are confronting businesses seeking to do work for government.
Yep. And look, I think that there's a transition, and we all see it in the, if you like, the shift from a traditional manufacturing base to a base of supply that is more focused on smart and innovative professional services, and, if you like, the next wave of industry expertise that Australia is going to be famous for is that smart industry that we're growing here. And it seems that, and this is reflected directly through the voices of our members, that procurement policy by its very nature has evolved to favour the large suppliers, to favour the big guys, if you like, who have the ability to organise themselves, who have the ability to pay very experienced, wise and influential blue chip kind of advocates who help them promote their goods and services. And the irony, it is an irony, is that they are experienced. They got a lot of runway, if you like, to influence and win tenders. And then they entrench themselves in there. And their ability to do this and thwart, if you like, successful outcomes is legendary. I don't need to quote you the billions of dollars that has gone offshore with many, many failed large technology projects that the citizens of Australia suffer the impact of that. Billions and billions of dollars when the large multinationals get entrenched. Now, we aren't adverse to that. So the Business Council feels that constructively it's about helping the smaller, more nimble players get into the supply chain with the large guys. And that federal policy can be a driver to drive that behaviour so that everybody wins. I think that ultimately it's about project outcomes and deliverables. And we've seen year upon year of this aggregation of centralisation of large contracts where it's one big throat to choke, essentially. And so the little guys get left out. And the irony is that these guys are subject matter experts. They have the ability to drive innovation into contracts and into projects. And they have the ability to keep the system honest because they are very, very hungry to deliver an outcome.
Ms. Melbourne, what does that, you mentioned, you see a key to that interaction between large and small being, a platform of collaboration. What does that look like, or what should that look like in the eyes of the Canberra Business Council to be an effective and dynamic? And I think most importantly, you made the point about the capacity to innovate, and often that is reliant on the presence of the smaller, more nimble companies that bring new ideas. So how would you like to see Commonwealth procurement policy shaped to achieve those goals?
So if we take the approach that it's a cycle, a life cycle, if we talk about early engagement with industry, so at the very beginning of industry helping to supply innovative goods and services to the federal government, the irony is that innovation in its very nature is difficult to describe. And in a tender requirements sort of context is that the bureaucrats, with the greatest respect, often don't know the right questions to ask, or they don't know how to define a set of requirements that enables innovation. So ironically, what they're doing is reinforcing or entrenching the past in a requirement specification. So government policy needs to drive the opening up of that.
So at the specification stage, when the tender documents are being prepared, you're saying that that's where government or the bureaucrats need to have that
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah. And look, I'm sure this is not the first time you've heard this. So early industry engagement is absolute best practice there. So before probity, before there's any, knowledge in the marketplace that, a certain prime contractor has already seeded a tender, that industry genuinely has the opportunity to put their bright ideas forward.
Okay, and I'm very conscious, being a senator for the ACT, the impact on our local economy with regard to procurement practices and the access of companies that identify Canberra, potentially open up an office here with the view of trying to break into that government market. Can you describe for the committee the nature of both the social and economic impact of Commonwealth procurement in general terms, but also with some specific examples? And I note that recently the company Dataflex cited that their inability to, prevail in a tender or in a contract with the Commonwealth is them at least for a period of time going into administration. So I'm just keen to get a feel for it, looking at our ACT and regional economy and Commonwealth procurement.
It's a really, really good question. I've got some statistics here in front of me, is that small business accounts for 95% of the ACT private sector. So that is over a third of those organisations operate with a turnover of between $200,000 and $2 million. So in the context of a supply chain, there is a lot of small businesses here. But remember what I said about the definition of a small business is typically they're subject matter experts, particularly in this region and in this city. They are ninja-style organisations that are generally operated by experts that have come out of the federal cycle. They may have been a former employee, or they may have been a former employee of one of the multinationals who are now having a go. So it makes for a unique ecosystem here. And there's a multiplicity of benefits of us actually helping them to get into the supply chain effectively, because what we've seen through our membership is that there is a growing number of these subject matter experts that are now exporting their goods and services interstate and internationally. So that is absolutely, I think, one of the key benefits of us being very deliberate about driving Australian industry growth, because it will drive export revenue, it will drive new money into our economy. We believe that a lot of Canberra companies are already making their marks overseas, and what that does is it drives a reputation for not only our city that serves the federal government, but our nation, that serves global best practice across a whole range of industry sectors, that puts eyes on our industry, and that helps those industries to grow and attract new industries to set up here as well from overseas.
No, thank you for that. And I am certainly familiar with some of the benefits of what it is to have a Commonwealth contract, particularly in the IT space, and I've often described it as an export credential. Can you just reflect perhaps briefly on I think probably elaborate on what you've been talking about having a Commonwealth contract means for small companies seeking to grow their business, particularly into that export market, and how does that look and feel from a business person's point of view?
So you're talking about the accelerator impact?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? Yeah. I think that Canberra, more than anywhere, experiences that, if you like, the consolidation of those organisations who are vying for federal government contracts. And generally, there's a lot of experience that people need to bring to the table to actually be successful in winning a government contract. But there is a perception in the market that it's not an even playing field. Yeah, that when a tender comes to the market, that if you haven't been in there influencing and if you don't know the players, that it's not about, lining up and running a race together. It's a perception, and sometimes it goes in your favour and sometimes it goes against you, and it is about perception. So one of the concepts that a lot of industry players talk about is transparency. So the transparency of that process is critical. So that procurement probity inadvertently creates a secrecy culture, and it perceives that the deal's already done when a tender comes to market. So there's a whole range of things that help industry to overcome that. And one of the things that we've seen a lot of lately are cancelled procurements. Right. So tenders where small, medium and large organisations across the range have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in responding to a request to tender. It could be an expression of interest or a request for quote, but that those procurement activities get cancelled. And it's very difficult to get a satisfactory answer, when you can't actually interact with those players. So, we have plenty of ideas about some of the best practice ideas for transparency. Mm-hmm. And essentially it's about rewarding good behaviour and driving good behaviour. Obviously, tenders need to be cancelled for reasons that are beyond people's control, but industry knowing about that and being able to understand it is really important. One of the best practice tendering systems that we see a lot of is the Singapore system, the GBiz system, which is extremely transparent. So if your tender deadline is 4 p.m. in the afternoon, all of the tenderers who are pre-registered, who've already been through a pre-authentication process for all the legal and contractual and compliance elements of dealing with government. They only have to do it once. It's all centralised. Once they put in their tender, let's say they're tendering for a $2 million project, the procurement process has given a pricing indication through the process. So it's set. It's about, we're not going to pay 10 million. We want to pay something around 2 or 3. And there's some fuzzy edges there, but it gives everybody an indication on what they're expecting to spend. And then at that point, when the tender closes and all the submissions are in, there is a summary note that lists all of the tenderers and their supply partners, the price that they've bid, and the value for money breakdown in that. And all of the other tenderers see that at that point in time. It's all automated. So you can see the lowest bid through to the highest bid, and you can actually see which of the prime contractors and their suppliers are fulfilling which elements of the contract. So and then industry sorts it out from there. Government doesn't need to hide or control anything. It's open, and industry gets itself organised next time if they weren't happy with.
Would you like to see that kind of transparency?
It's a really good system, and I'd really love to know that the Australian government is talking to Singapore about the challenges that they've overcome, because it might be an expedient way to get some good best practice there.
Yeah. Can I just follow up 2 points that you made? You said there's a perception that, the process isn't a level playing field, and mentioned also the issue of probity requirements and the secrecy surrounding probity requirements. The way I interpreted your evidence is that has contributed to the perception that it's not a level playing field. Am I interpreting your comments correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a kind of a systemic thing. If you think about it as a life cycle, you go back to my suggestion about early engagement with industry. Yeah, there comes a point in time where you cannot talk to, the team of people that's put out the tender. So when you are reading through a set of requirements and you think, that's really dumb, why are they doing that? You have no ability to engage. Right. And so that's where we see time and time again, you get this entrenched thinking, and it locks out the ability to innovate, because if you are innovating, you ironically end up being non-compliant.
Yeah, right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, and so in a cyclic way, when you lock the doors for probity reasons, you're actually locking the door on common sense many times.
So what you're saying is that unless the bureaucrats responsible for that procurement process are right at the forefront of thinking in that whatever the service
Yeah.
area is,
Yeah.
they are potentially locking out
Yeah.
innovative new
Yep.
ideas or dare I say, disruptive technologies
Yeah.
that threaten the entrenched methodology.
Exactly.
Okay. One more question and then I'll hand over to colleagues. Procurement panels and pre-selection. Can you advise the committee how that's operating in general and whether there are specific changes or barriers to participation from that process? I think we're all reasonably familiar with the efficiencies that come with having the operation of panels or a form of pre-selection of tenderers, but I'd be very interested to hear from a business point of view what both the perception and reality is of the function of those panels and pre-selection processes.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and there is no one-size-fits-all answer for any of this, is there? It is about being organised, and I think the most important thing that these panels need to do is to drive industry, yeah?
No, that's right. Sorry, keep going.
Sorry.
I'm just checking if my colleagues have any questions. Yeah.
Okay. I think one of the biggest pieces of insight that we can give to this hearing is that none of our members believe that centralisation or aggregation is a good idea.
Right. In terms of procurement processes.
That's exactly right. So it's a logical objective, and you can see the cycle over many, many years has been to sort of consolidate and be efficient, right? But what that does is it drives it drives everything into the favour of the larger companies.
Well,
yeah,
we saw that with the clustered approach to IT outsourcing back in the late 90s.
Yeah, look, and we can give you numerous references about those service arrangements, or those panel arrangements that end up actually not delivering the value for money that they were set up to deliver. And the proportion of failed projects is increasing. Whether it's the reporting of those failed projects is more prevalent, but some of them hurt. Some of them really hurt. Those.
I'm going to ask Senator Xenophon, but could I ask you to take on notice, providing the committee with some more commentary about this issue of panels and pre-selection of tenders, and in particular, your strongest ideas about how they should or could operate, or if there's a hybrid system that, in your view, would be the most effective to allow the objectives of Commonwealth procurement, i.e. value for money, innovation, etc., to be achieved.
Okay, so we have that here, and we'd be delighted to write to you.
Thank you. As soon as possible,
Okay,
please.
well, it's here.
Oh, if you'd like to table a document today, that would be brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Over to you,
Through
Senator
Chair.
Xenophon.
And Ms Melbourne, further to the Chair's comments, that would be incredibly useful. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to juggle with another committee I'm meant to be on today, so it's just, there's only one of me. But can you provide some further details as requested by the Chair, and also matters arising out of this? But also I want to ask you, in terms of, you know, your ideas appear to be practical and based on common sense. But when you deal with bureaucracies about these issues, when you raise the lack of transparency in contrast with the Singapore government system of procurement, what responses do you get, or do you not get any responses, or is it dismissive? Is it condescending? When you raise these common sense practical issues and equity issues, what happens?
Look, I think by far and away that certainly all of the procurement professionals inside government that we've dealt with have been working very, very hard to do the right thing. Yeah, that they're all very professional and making sure that everything is done correctly. And the irony is that we've locked our system down so much that it's so bureaucratic, and we apply so much process to this that we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot. So I really think that we have to take a step back and be really prepared to do some things differently than what we have already done in the past. I think the key for us and what we see here in Canberra, and indeed on behalf of Australia, is that we're at the forefront of a global market, and we want the overseas players to be here. We don't want to lock them out. So we need to be smart about driving Australian industry, and we can do that really simply with things like a better definition of value for money. And do things like be transparent, because what that does is it sets the scene for industry to get itself a little bit more organised. When you see who's partnering with who, what multinational is partnering with a local company to help them deliver innovation in their big project.
When it goes to the issue of value for money, do you consider that they need to take into account, the governments need to take into account the fact that if the work is being done here, there are significant
Yes.
flow-on benefits to the economy
Yes.
and the like?
Yes. Well, look, I don't know if you've seen it lately, but there was an envelope case study. I noticed that you had the paper people in here just before us.
Is that back of envelope or just an envelope?
The supply of envelopes to the government. It's very interesting, and I've got the link here. I can send it to you later. But essentially, an overseas company was selected on the value for money basis, and it was the RRP was the value for money, right? So it was an overseas company got the deal. An Australian company had been the incumbent. I think it was something like 8%. They were 8% more expensive than the overseas company.
I think it was less than 1%, but $8,000.
Oh, right.
Was
so,
the
okay.
evidence.
I think you're right. So the 8 stuck in my mind.
I think it was $8,000 in a
A reasonable
multi-million-dollar
person would say that was a negligible difference in the value for money. Now, if the value for money calculation or formula had have taken into account the GST or the employment uplift or their ability to open another office or grow as a result of that procurement episode.
And the taxes paid. And the taxes paid by the workers and the company.
So it's a very simple policy driver that's not a stick, but it's a very simple procurement policy driver that will help give a bit of uplift for Australian companies. So when all things are equal, when the product and the quality and all that sort of stuff is kind of equal, our procurement policy should somehow favour a local supplier.
And finally, when you raise these practical common sense issues, what response do you get from governments in terms of changing policy?
Well, the Canberra Business Council, its voice has been heard long and strong for many years in this regard.
But are they listening?
Well, we're here.
We're listening, but those that make the decisions.
Just to give you an example, at a local level, for those who don't know me, I'm Chris Folks, the CEO. We've been successful over the last couple of years to have the ACT government procurement policy changed, so that, again, everything being equal, local companies get a 5% uplift, if you like, up to 10% in certain circumstances, so that, as I said, this is not about favouring local companies no matter what. It's about everything else being equal. You give the local company a little bit of an edge, and there are only two reasons. One is industry capability development, and the second one is innovation. That's it.
Is there a threshold value for the contracts for that change in policy?
What was that, sorry?
Is there a threshold value for the contracts?
Yes, it's under $200,000. It's
Okay.
only for small...
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you,
Senator
Chair.
Madigan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms Mel, Ms Fawkes. Earlier in your presentation, you've told us that big is not necessarily better. And then we've got the term that's coined, inverted commas, best value for money. Would you say it would be fair to say that the analysis of when we're purchasing, government is purchasing Australian-made goods and services, that there's not enough analysis done as to the social and economic benefits of buying Australian-made and procured goods and giving them proper weighting for the benefits that they bring to our community, as Senator Xenophon said, through taxation, better social outcomes, that the fact that when people have a sense of self-worth and gainful employment, there's less alcohol, drug abuse, domestic violence, mental health issues, vandalism, and all of these things have a cost to our community and society as a whole, and that this isn't given enough weight in procurement decisions.
Yeah, I agree. One example directly from a member just recently was that he is very interested in supplying one of our federal government agencies with sporting apparel. He's one of the only, or his firm is one of the only Australian suppliers of these goods. And he was told by the federal government agency that they already had their contracts locked in with the multinationals, and his call to me was out of frustration that he sponsors a lot of sporting teams here in Canberra and in Australia. He supplies his gear free of charge to very, very important grassroots community-based organisations, and is an integral member of the Australian business community. Is a young entrepreneur who sky's the limit and essentially is locked out of this process. And his innocent comment to me was, well, why? What do these other organisations give back to our local community? The federal agency, that he understands that they have to buy in power and bulk buying and all that sort of stuff. But when the chips are down, when you actually analyse what Australian society is missing out on by not at least giving him an opportunity to have some of that work, is that he cares about the community that he lives in, and he employs people and gives back in that community. And so, without getting into sort of the grassroots of it, if the value for money formula can account for that local industry development and contribution to the community, then I think that's a very easy way for policy settings to drive outcomes for Australian industry.
Do you have more?
From what you've said, do you believe that there's, could you elaborate on whether you think that the rhetoric and the reality, when we hear about government, local government, state government, and in this case federal government, talking about Australian companies innovating, that there's a real disconnect between what government says and what government does, and that there's a lack of understanding about amortising costs, because if they don't have that critical mass, it is extremely hard for Australian businesses, small, medium and large, to amortise their costs to provide the level of service that our governments expect of them.
Yeah. So in the context of our membership base, which is largely smart services style of companies, so we don't represent manufacturing, to that degree, but essentially it's about that industry participation where the large and the small coexisting and collaborating and partnering is what is the accepted culture. So we don't want to exclude anybody from the supply chain, and the policy settings must drive behaviour of the big guys to be pulling along and including the smaller guys, and vice versa, that the smaller guys, who are the subject matter experts largely, are not locked out of influencing or participating with the big guys. Now, I know that there's some fabulous federal programs, the Australian Industry Participation Plan, that we've had a lot to do with, but it has no teeth. And unfortunately, it needs more life. So we need to make sure that it doesn't lose its funding. And we need to make sure that industry advocates, who are wise brokers, if you like, of collaboration, we need to make sure that their funding... The supplier advocates have been really good and very welcomed by industry, because they're kind of a bridge between industry and government. So the supplier advocates, I presume that you're familiar with those. Industry has really been grateful for the work that they've done and hope that that continues. But I believe it's a little bit token, needs to be more serious than it has been. So I wonder if it was a trial, but we would certainly encourage that Australian industry participation program gets better. And there's been some unintended consequences of that as well, where SMEs have had to comply as if they were a multi-billion-dollar company, which is a different story. But.
Just to follow up with that, to your knowledge, would your proposed changes or strengthening of the value for money definition bump into any multilateral or bilateral trade agreement prohibitions?
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, because in my experience, and we certainly have a lot in the US and in the face of the free trade agreement in that context, is that it's not a playing field for me over there. It's not an even playing field for our company over there. So it's just not. So we mind our P's and Q's and kind of, follow the rules with the free trade agreement. But the US does not do that. They are fiercely parochial. Each state and procurement body that you deal with over there asks you, who is your local partner? What are you going to leave behind? What are the skills that you're bringing? What are the innovations? Are you working with a veteran-owned company? Are you working with a company that is owned by an African-American directors? Are you working with a company that's owned by a director with a disability? So they are asking all of these questions that is about driving behaviour. They're policy settings that are either state-based or nationally based, that drive me as an overseas supplier to engage with local industry.
What would be the transformative effect if those same questions were asked of companies seeking to do business with the Commonwealth?
Well, exactly like you said, it would be transformative, and I think it would be extremely constructive for Australian industry if our policy settings were asking those questions. And it comes back to my point before about the definition of value for money. Yeah, you don't need to beat it with a stick. The value for money piece can come when we ask, what are you doing for local industry development? How many people will you employ? Who will own the innovation from this?
Does the Business Council believe we should codify what that looks like? And I guess it's a reference back to previous schemes like Partnerships for Development, which required a percentage of participation in contracts over a certain value of SMEs. So we're still not bumping into our free trade agreements because we're talking about SMEs rather than Australianness. Do you have a specific view or policy as an organisation representing business on that issue?
Yeah, absolutely, and I've got it in my opening statement. I didn't actually read it out, but we believe that something like 20% of the rating system should be attributed to promoting Australian industry development and economic development. It should be deliberate about driving and commercialising smart Australian innovation, particularly in this technology age. There's so much opportunity. Sorry,
Ms Melbourne, could I ask you to table your opening statement so we could have that reference, please?
Yep.
Thank you.
We'll table the document.
Thank you. I have a final question. Do you have more questions, Senator Madigan, or are you done? Just one more. I'll come back to you. We've heard a bit of evidence about the application and, if you like, compliance with both the National Waste Policy and the ICT Sustainability Policy. Are you able to give the committee an insight as to its effectiveness, its capacity to improve the opportunity for Australian companies, or SMEs, if you like, functioning effectively under both of those policies? If not, I'm happy for you to take that on notice if you have a view.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea for us to take that on notice. There would be some really valuable insights from some of our members to comment on that.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you. Senator Madigan, final question.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Melbourne, when we get to talk about free trade agreements, WTO rules, would you say it's fair to say that Australian government, generally departments, doesn't utilise the rules, so to speak, as do our competitors. That there seems to be a lack of understanding of what you can and can't do, a very narrow, blinkered approach compared to our major competitors in manufacturing, high tech, whatever. That our major competitors around the world are far more lucid when it comes to being innovative with the use of these rules than what we are.
Yes, I agree.
And as such, we get the raw end of the prawn, don't
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's something to be said about parochialism, but in the context of driving behaviour. Yeah, so I've said it before, is that we are not advocating pro or protectionism at all, because inadvertently that would lock a lot of our members out of doing business in other jurisdictions, right? So it's fair, and industry is pretty good at sorting itself out. What we are talking about is being sensible when we ask of our overseas suppliers, what are you doing for industry development in the context of this procurement? What are you doing what are you leaving behind? What is your footprint? If you're not paying tax here, right, we can deal with that. What else are you going to do in the context of this project that we would award you?
So I'd say, what is the social and the economic benefit analysis of your involvement in Australian government contracts? What are you leaving behind? What are you doing to advance Australia's interests, as including your own? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I invite the Canberra Business Council to provide to the committee any further documentation that you have prepared or that may be directly relevant to our terms of reference? We're very appreciative of your time to appear today, conscious that you did not make a submission but were able to come forth with a very valuable input, so we appreciate that very much.
Thank
You're
you.
excused.
Thank you very much. Thank you.